In the collective memory of the world, some dates are not merely numbers, they are tombstones. 476 AD, the fall of Rome. 1789, the storming of the Bastille. But one date echoes with a unique and terrible finality: 1453. This is the story of the death of an empire, the end of the Byzantine world, the moment the Middle Ages were shattered by gunpowder, and the modern age was born in blood and fire. For centuries, this city was the envy of the world. They called it Basileusa, the Queen of Cities, a bastion of Christianity, a fortress of Roman legacy, a treasure chest of art and holy relics. It was simply the city, Polis. To its people, it was the center of the known universe. By 1453, the empire was a ghost, a head without a body. Its lands were gone, picked clean by rivals, and conquered by the relentless advance of the Ottoman Turks. All that remained was the city itself, a few nearby islands, and a sliver of land in Greece. Inside these legendary walls, the Theodosian Walls, which had never been breached in 1,000 years, lived perhaps 50,000 souls. They were the last Romans. They were merchants, monks, nuns, scholars, fishermen, and families. And outside those walls, a new power had risen. A 21-year-old Sultan, Mehmed II, brilliant, ruthless, and consumed by a single obsession: to conquer Constantinople, to fulfill what he saw as an Islamic prophecy. He amassed an army of over 80,000 men, and he brought with him a monster, a new technology that would change warfare forever: the Great Bombard, a cannon so massive it hurled 1,200-pound stone balls over a mile, aimed directly at the heart of the world's greatest defense. The siege began on April 6, 1453. For 53 days, the world held its breath. History loves this grand narrative: the clash of titans, Sultan Mehmed the Conqueror versus the last emperor, Constantine XI Palaiologos. We are told of the giant cannons, the ships hauled over land, the final heroic charge of the last emperor, dying anonymously in the breach. But this is not that story. This is the story history chose to forget, the story that was deliberately silenced. This is what really happened to the 50,000 civilians cowering behind the walls. Because the fall of a city is not just a geopolitical event, it is a human catastrophe. And the price for the birth of a new empire was about to be paid, not by the soldiers, but by the ordinary people who called this city home. Inside the besieged city, the air was thick with more than cannon smoke. It was thick with fear, denial, and a strange, fatalistic hope. This city had survived over 20 sieges. Its people were raised on stories of divine intervention. Hadn't the armies of the Avars and the Arabs been turned back by miraculous storms? Hadn't the icon of the Virgin Mary, the Hodegetria, protected them before? They looked to their 1,000-year-old walls, the strongest in the world. They looked to the heavens, they trusted in God, but they did not trust each other. The city was split by a deep, spiritual wound. Years earlier, the emperor, desperate for military aid from the West, had agreed to unite the Orthodox Church with the Catholic Pope in Rome. To many of the city's devout, this was a profound betrayal, a pact with heretics. The Grand Duke, Lucas Notaras, the most powerful man after the emperor, famously declared, "I would rather see the Turkish turban in the midst of the city than the Latin mitre." This was not mere rhetoric. It was a schism that paralyzed the defense. While Venetian and Genoese mercenaries fought bravely on the walls, many of the city's own citizens refused to help what they saw as a corrupted regime. They prayed for a miracle, but refused to pick up a shovel. Niccolò Barbaro, a Venetian surgeon trapped in the city, wrote of this madness in his diary. The Greeks were divided among themselves. They were concerned with their religious disputes while the Sultan was at their gates. They spent their days arguing whether the Latins were dogs or brothers, while the cannonballs of the Turks gave their answer from the walls. And then came the omens. On the 22nd of May, the moon, the symbol of the city, rose in a dark, bloody eclipse. A prophecy of the city's fall was whispered in every alley. As long as the moon waxes, the city will stand. But when it wanes, the city will be lost. The people were terrified. The emperor ordered the Hagia, the holiest icon of the Virgin, to be paraded through the streets to raise morale. It was a disaster. The icon, heavy and ancient, slipped from its platform and fell to the ground. As the priests struggled to lift it, a sudden, violent hailstorm erupted, forcing the procession to be abandoned. To the people, the message was clear. Heaven had turned its face away. Their protector had fallen. Inside the walls, the illusion of invincibility was crumbling, replaced by the chilling realization that they were alone. At 1:30 a.m. on Tuesday, May 29th, the final assault began. Sultan Mehmed unleashed all 80,000 of his troops in 3 successive waves. The first were the Bashi bazooks, irregular mercenaries, driven forward as cannon fodder to exhaust the defenders. The second wave was the disciplined Anatolian infantry. For hours, the 7,000 defenders, a mixed force of Greeks, Venetians, and Genoese, held the line. They fought with the courage of doomed men. The air was filled with the screams of the dying, the clash of steel, and the unceasing thunder of the bombards. Just before sunrise, disaster struck. The cannons opened a massive breach in the Lycus Valley. At the same time, a small contingent of Turks discovered something unthinkable: a postern gate, a small, unlocked door used by civilians. The Kirkaporta. It had been left open. The cry spread faster than fire. The city is taken! For the soldiers on the walls, it was the end of the fight. For the 50,000 civilians, it was the beginning of a nightmare from which there would be no waking. The historian priest, Leonard of Chios, an eyewitness, described the moment the defense collapsed. A terrible cry arose. "The Turks are in the city." Our own men, hearing this, lost all heart. They fled, trampling one another, running from the walls in a mad panic. They ran, not to fight, but to save their wives and children. It was the end. Panic seized the population. There was nowhere to run. The sea was blockaded. The walls were breached. They ran for the only place they believed offered salvation, the last sanctuary, the holiest place in Christendom. Thousands upon thousands, men, women, and children, streamed through the streets, pushing, climbing over the fallen, a river of humanity flowing towards one building. They ran to the Hagia Sophia, the great church of holy wisdom. They bolted its massive bronze doors, believing in one final prophecy, that when the Turks reached the column of Constantine inside the church, an angel would descend from heaven with a flaming sword and drive them out, saving the city and the empire. They huddled together under the vast dome beneath the gaze of the seraphim mosaics. They were not praying for victory. They were praying for a miracle. The angel was not coming. Sultan Mehmed had made a promise to his soldiers, a promise as old as warfare: 3 days. For 3 days, the city was theirs, its wealth, its buildings, and its people. Whatever they could find, they could keep. It was the right of conquest. What happened next was not war. It was a systematic 3-day harvest of a civilization, and the Hagia Sophia was its epicenter. The soldiers poured in. They were not driven by faith, but by greed. They saw not a congregation, but a treasure trove. They ripped the gold-plated icons from the walls, tore the jeweled altar cloths, and smashed the sacred relics. But the true prize was the people. Leonard of Chios, who survived the ordeal, wrote what he saw. Who can recount the horror? They seized them. The nobles, the commoners, the monks, the nuns. They were tied together in long lines. The ropes cut into their arms. The old and the sick, who could not be moved or were of no value, were slaughtered without mercy. The youngest among them were ripped from their families, their fates sealed in an instant. The crowd was divided by value. The elderly and the infirm were cut down where they stood. The strong young men were immediately shackled, destined for a life of hard labor or service. But the greatest prize was the women and the young captives. The soldiers fought each other for the most valuable. Noble women, dressed in silk, were bound to peasant girls in rags. Nuns, who had never seen the world outside their convents, were dragged by their hair into the streets. The historian Stephen Runciman, piecing together survivor accounts, wrote that in the Great Church, blood ran in rivers. The sanctity of the church was shattered. It became a stage for unimaginable humiliation and brutality. For thousands, especially the women, a terrible fate awaited them inside the very walls they believed would protect them. Their dignity was systematically dismantled. This was not random violence. It was a tool of conquest. It was meant to break not just the bodies, but the spirit, the faith, and the bloodline of the Byzantine people. This horror was repeated in every church, every monastery, every home in the city. Families were destroyed in an instant. The historian Ducas, another contemporary, wrote of the city's elite. He described noblewomen who had lived their entire lives in sheltered palaces, now yoked together like animals and paraded through the streets, their honor stripped from them, pelted with filth by the victorious troops. What of the Grand Duke, Lucas Notaras, the man who preferred the Sultan's turban to the Pope's mitre? He was captured and brought before Sultan Mehmed. He, who had been the most powerful man in the city, was now a captive. According to the historian Ducas, the Grand Duke's pride and his refusal to submit to the conqueror's ultimate authority sealed his fate. In a cold rage, Mehmed ordered Notaras and his adult sons to be executed on the spot. The last of the city's high command was gone. For 3 days, this was the reality. The city was scoured. Every building was emptied. Every human being was categorized, valued, and claimed as property. By the end of the 3rd day, the Queen of Cities was a silent, smoking husk. An estimated 4,000 civilians lay dead in the streets, and over 30,000 more were gone. They had vanished, captured, enslaved, and marched out of the city they once called home. On the 3rd day, as promised, Sultan Mehmed entered the city. He was no longer the conqueror, he was the master. He rode to the Hagia Sophia. Dismounting, he stooped to pick up a handful of earth, pouring it over his head in a gesture of humility before Allah. He walked inside, past the corpses and the filth. He saw a soldier smashing the marble pavement. The Sultan struck the man down with his saber, shouting, "I have given you the captives and the treasure. The buildings are mine." The plunder was over. The city and everything in it now belonged to him, his new capital. But what of the 30,000 captives? The survivors were gathered in the great public squares. They were sorted like cargo. Families were separated with a final, brutal indifference. Loved ones were torn from each other, never to meet again. Niccolo Barbaro, the Venetian surgeon, managed to escape by ship. He watched the final, heartbreaking exodus. Throughout the day, the Turks dragged the Greeks, men and women, young and old, from the city, a terrible thing to see. They were yoked and driven, weeping and crying out. And when one would fall from exhaustion, they were beaten. They were our brothers in Christ, and we watched, helpless, as they were led away to servitude. These 30,000 people were divided. A portion was given to the Sultan himself. The most skilled artisans, the most beautiful women, and the strongest youths were taken for the Topkapi Palace. Another portion was given to his generals and viziers as a reward. The vast majority were marched to the great slave markets of the Ottoman Empire, to Edirne, to Bursa, to Gallipoli. Here, the last of their dignity was stripped away. They were sold for pennies. Contemporary letters and records, found later in archives, paint a sickening picture. A well-educated scholar might be sold for the price of a pair of shoes. A young captive, deemed a valuable commodity, might fetch a high price for a wealthy man's private household. This was the Great Scattering, the diaspora of 1453. These people, the last of the Byzantines, were dispersed across the entire Ottoman world. They vanished into the private estates and households of the vast Ottoman world. Their names were changed. Their language was forbidden. Their religion was erased. Within a single generation, their identity which had endured for over 1,000 years, was effectively extinguished. This is the fate that history books summarize in a single, sterile word: enslaved. Sultan Mehmed was a visionary, but he was also a pragmatist. He had conquered a capital, but he now ruled a wasteland. A city of 50,000 people was now home to perhaps less than 10,000, hiding in the ruins. An emperor needs a capital. A capital needs people. If he could not keep the old population, he would import a new one. He enacted a policy known as surgun, forced resettlement. He issued decrees ordering thousands of his subjects, Muslims, Christians, and Jews, from every corner of his empire to move to his new capital, now renamed Constantinople, or, as it would come to be known, Istanbul. The city was reborn, but it was no longer Byzantine. It was Ottoman. The great church of Hagia Sophia became the Hagia Sophia Mosque, the symbol of Islamic triumph. The city's remaining Greek families were allowed to live, to work, and to worship, but as dhimmi, second-class citizens, tolerated, but never again masters of their own destiny. The Sultan even appointed a new Orthodox patriarch, Gennadios Scholarios, a man who had been famously against the union with Rome. It was a brilliant political move. It gave the remaining Greek population a leader, but one who was now completely under the Sultan's control. But not all was lost. In the chaos of the fall, a few managed to escape. Scholars, artists, and thinkers, carrying with them the priceless knowledge of the ancient world, Greek philosophy, Roman law, science, and art. They fled west to Venice, to Florence, to Rome. They brought with them the texts of Plato and Aristotle, the knowledge of their ancestors. This flood of intellect, this lost wisdom arriving in Italy, would ignite the flames of a new age. It is one of history's greatest ironies. The death of Constantinople, the event that marked the end of the classical world, was the very spark that lit the fire of the European Renaissance. The empire died, but its ideas, carried by the traumatized survivors, would change the world forever. Today, Istanbul is a vibrant, thriving metropolis of 15 million people. The Theodosian Walls are a park. The Hagia Sophia is a world treasure. The ghosts of 1453 are silent. Why has this story, the story of the 50,000 civilians, been so thoroughly buried? History, as we are told, is written by the victors. For the triumphant Ottoman Empire, the fall of Constantinople was a glorious liberation, a fulfillment of destiny. The harsh realities of the conquest, the plunder, the mass enslavement, these were inconvenient details, smoothed over and forgotten, replaced by tales of Mehmed's wisdom and glory. And for the West, the fall was a humiliation, a failure of Christendom to protect its own. It was easier to mourn the loss of an abstract empire than to confront the visceral, human cost of its fall. The true cost of war is never measured in territory lost or empires gained. It is not found in the chronicles of sultans and emperors. It is measured in human souls. It is found in the silenced voices, in the families torn apart, the cultures erased, and the 30,000 lives that vanished into the ledgers of slave markets. The fall of Constantinople was not just the end of an empire. It was a human tragedy on a scale that is almost impossible to comprehend. Their story is not a footnote to a grand political event. It is the event. Their names are lost. Their faces are unknown. But their fate, the brutal, forgotten fate of the last citizens of Rome, is the true lesson of 1453. A lesson written in the blood and tears of the innocent, whispering to us from across the centuries, if only we have the courage to listen.